It's always 3 o'clock a.m., that 1 hour when the world sleeps. And you don't. You lie there in the dark, your heart somehow too loud, your mind somehow too full, and the silence, it feels heavier than noise, but you're not alone. Frank Richards is 71 years old. He hasn't set an alarm since retiring, but somehow, his body still knows. 3:07 a.m. every night, like clockwork. His eyes open gently as if something had whispered his name. No traffic, no wind, no bird song, not even the hum of the fridge, just the soft chill in the air and the faint clink of ceramic as he pours himself a small cup of tea. Frank sits by the kitchen window. Outside, Asheville, North Carolina is asleep under a quiet sky. Inside, there's a kind of stillness that only those who have lived alone for a while truly recognize. Why do I keep waking up at this hour? What is it that wants my attention so badly? Frank never thought he'd lose the ability to sleep deeply. Back in his younger days, he could drift off on a subway bench, sleep through a thunderstorm, even doze mid-flight across 3 time zones without a problem. But something changed after he turned 60. Sleep became fragile. The slightest creak of the floorboards, a cool breeze slipping through a cracked window, enough to stir him awake. And ever since his wife passed, those awakenings came more often, lingering longer. Because the truth is, the body changes with age, and so does the way it sleeps. Melatonin, the hormone that helps signal the body to rest, gradually decreases over time. Deep restorative sleep becomes shorter, replaced by lighter sleep cycles that are more easily interrupted. And the body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm, begins to shift too. Frank noticed that no matter how early he went to bed, 9:30, even 10 p.m., he would still wake up around 3 a.m., as if his brain had already finished its job, wrapped up the night too early. I used to sleep through thunderstorms, he thought. Now I wake up from silence. It wasn't just light sleep or a drafty room. Something deeper was stirring Frank awake, from the inside out. What he didn't know, not then, was that his body was following a silent signal, one wired into his biology. Its name? Cortisol. Cortisol is often called the stress hormone, but it's also what prepares the body to wake up, to face the day, to rise and respond. In a healthy sleep cycle, cortisol levels naturally rise in the early morning, helping you feel alert, focused, and ready to move. For younger adults, this rise often happens around 5 or 6 a.m. But as we age, that rhythm shifts forward. The cortisol surge comes earlier, sometimes hours before dawn. For Frank, it meant that by 3 o'clock a.m., his brain was already getting the memo. Time to wake up. Not because of anxiety, not because of a nightmare, but because his body thought the day had begun. This isn't a malfunction. It's not even a warning sign. It's a survival mechanism, part of a system that evolved to help us meet the world with readiness. Only now that system was running a little ahead of schedule. And so, night after night, Frank found himself wide awake in the dark. Not because something was wrong, but because in a way, his body thought it was doing its job. Frank once blamed the creaking floors, then the old thermostat, then grief. But even after making his bedroom quieter, warmer, more comfortable, he was still waking up, still feeling unrested. It turns out sleep in older adults isn't just affected by one thing. It's a tangle of small disruptions, each whispering through the night. Body temperature regulation begins to falter with age. Our internal thermostat becomes less precise, making it harder to stay in the ideal sleep zone. Frank would often wake feeling cold, even with a blanket. Sometimes he'd overheat and kick it off. These minor shifts were enough to pull him out of already light sleep. Then came the restless legs, that strange, buzzing sensation that made him twitch or move just as he was about to drift off again. And though he didn't snore loudly, he'd started waking with a dry throat, a subtle sign that something deeper might be going on. What Frank was experiencing, says Dr. Melissa Tran, a geriatric sleep specialist in Denver, are classic signs of age-related sleep disturbance, especially in men over 65. Conditions like sleep apnea, even when mild or undiagnosed, become more common. So do things like restless leg syndrome, nocturia, needing to pee at night, and chronic pain, all of which fragment sleep. The tricky part? Many of these issues don't feel urgent during the day. They're mild, manageable, until 3 a.m. comes around. If you wake often at night, Dr. Tran advises, talk to your doctor. Even if you think it's just aging, Ask about a sleep study, check for underlying conditions. The goal isn't perfect sleep. It's better sleep, with fewer barriers. For Frank, that conversation didn't happen until much later, but when it did, he realized it wasn't just in his head, his body really was asking for help. Frank used to be a night owl. He'd read until midnight, fall asleep with the radio humming softly, but lately he was ready for bed by 8:30. Some nights, he turned in before 9 hours, earlier than his grandchildren. He chuckled at the thought. But deep down, he wondered, why am I tired so early? And why do I wake up so early, whether I want to or not? The answer lies in a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, a tiny cluster of cells nestled in the hypothalamus. This is the master clock, the conductor of your circadian rhythm, regulating when your body feels alert or sleepy, hungry or satisfied. As we age, that master clock begins to drift. It's called Advanced Sleep Phase Syndrome, ASPS, explains Dr. Jordan Fields, a sleep medicine physician in Seattle. Older adults naturally feel sleepy earlier in the evening and tend to wake up earlier in the morning. It's not insomnia, it's biology. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's subtle. But over time, you start noticing. Feeling sleepy earlier than usual, waking up at 3 or 4 a.m. without an alarm, not being able to fall back asleep even when you still feel tired. A study published in the journal Sleep, Duffy et al., 2015, found that the circadian rhythm in older adults can shift by 1 to 2 hours earlier compared to younger individuals. That means your body may start and finish its sleep cycle sooner, even if your lifestyle doesn't match that shift. For Frank, this explained a lot. Even on nights when he stayed up later, his body still ended its sleep around 3 a.m., as if it had already checked off its list and decided, that's enough for tonight. But knowing this gave him something else too. Permission. It wasn't that I was broken, Frank later said. My rhythm had just changed. I just needed to learn to move with it. Expert advice. What you can do. Dr. Fields offers this simple guidance. If your body's clock is shifting earlier, try adjusting your light exposure. Spend time in bright light during the late afternoon or early evening. Even just sitting by a sunny window. Avoid bright screens and overhead lights at night. This helps reset the clock gently. You're not fighting biology and you're guiding it. She also recommends keeping a regular sleep and wake time, even on weekends. This helps reinforce the body's natural rhythm and reduces early morning awakenings. And most importantly, be kind to yourself, she says. Sleep changes with age. That's not a failure, that's life. But there are ways to work with it instead of against it. Frank used to think that once he fell asleep, nothing could wake him. But lately, it didn't take much. Some nights, it was just a slight chill in the room. Other nights, it was the way his shoulder ached from an old injury. And sometimes, it was that one familiar glass of red wine he sipped around 8:30 while watching the late news. None of it seemed serious on its own, but somehow, it all added up to the same result. Another night, another wake-up call, always around 3. What Frank didn't know then was that sleep at his age had become more fragile, more sensitive to even the smallest disturbances. As we get older, our bodies become less efficient at regulating core temperature during the night. The natural dip in body heat that helps signal the onset of sleep becomes inconsistent. Our internal thermostat, once so reliable, starts to misfire. A room that feels perfectly fine at bedtime may feel too cold at 2 a.m. or too warm just an hour later. For someone like Frank, who cycles between kicking off the covers and pulling them back again, that alone can be enough to pull him out of precious rest. Doctors who study sleep in older adults often point out how important this temperature balance really is. One clinical review from Aging Research Reviews highlights how age-related changes in thermal regulation can lead to disrupted sleep architecture, especially deep sleep. Dr. Hannah Lowell, a clinical sleep specialist, often reminds her patients that the solution isn't more blankets, but better awareness. A stable sleep environment, she says, matters more than people realize. Keeping the bedroom between 60 and 67 degrees, using breathable bedding, and skipping hot showers or heavy sleepwear before bed can all help the body stay where it needs to be. But temperature isn't the only quiet culprit. Frank's glass of wine, as comforting as it seemed, was also quietly interfering with his rest. Like many people, he believed alcohol helped him relax, and it did at first. But once the body begins metabolizing it, usually a few hours later, it triggers a rebound effect that can cause wakefulness. What feels like a gentle nightcap at 9 can easily become the reason for a restless stretch at 3. Alcohol suppresses REM sleep, the phase crucial for emotional and cognitive restoration, and contributes to early morning awakenings that are hard to recover from. And while Frank never drank excessively, that single glass had more power than he thought. The same went for light, particularly the kind that glows from a television screen or tablet. That soft blue light, so common in modern homes, quietly delays melatonin release, confusing the body's natural rhythm. Even if he didn't feel stimulated, his brain was being told, subtly but consistently, that it was not yet time to sleep. At first, Frank didn't know any of this. He only knew that his nights were broken into strange halves, and his mornings began long before the sun did. But over time, as he read more, asked more questions, and tried small changes, he started to notice a shift. He began dimming the lights earlier in the evening. He replaced that glass of wine with warm herbal tea. He started reading real books instead of scrolling through headlines. Nothing radical. Just a few quiet adjustments. But sleep, he realized, wasn't a switch you flipped. It was more like a room you slowly prepared. Lowering the lights, softening the sounds, clearing space, not just in the house, but in the mind. And in that preparation, something softened. The 3 a.m. awakenings still came, but they no longer felt like interruptions. They became invitations. Frank sat by the window, the same chair he'd used for years. Outside, the world was still asleep. No headlights passed on the street. The moon had dipped low behind the hills, just darkness, pressed softly against the glass. And in that darkness, the past had a way of coming back. He didn't plan to think about her. He never really did. But at 3 a.m, when the house was quiet and the heart was loud, memories rose on their own. Not the big ones, not the weddings or birthdays, the small ones. The sound of her laugh when she caught him sneaking a cookie before dinner, the way she folded towels, the smell of her favorite tea. He found himself whispering her name sometimes, like she might still answer. And then came the questions. Quiet, uninvited, but insistent. Why didn't I hold her hand longer in the hospital? Did I say goodbye the way I should have? Did she know how much I still needed her? During the day, those thoughts stayed buried, tucked behind schedules and phone calls and polite conversation. But in the stillness of early morning, there was no one else to listen. No TV to drown it out. No distraction to lean on. Just him. And the echo of what had been left unsaid. Psychologists call it nighttime rumination, the mind's tendency to spiral into reflection when external noise disappears. But for Frank, it didn't feel like a diagnosis. It felt like a kind of truth-telling, as if his soul had finally found room to speak. He wasn't afraid of the thoughts. Not anymore. They hurt, yes, but they were honest. And maybe honesty, even the painful kind, was its own kind of healing. Later, he would learn that this pattern, waking at 3, flooded with emotion, wasn't uncommon, especially in older adults who had experienced loss or change. The body wakes, but it's the heart that does the talking. He didn't try to fight it anymore. Instead, he listened. He let the questions come, and in doing so, he began to realize that maybe he wasn't waking up to remember the pain. Maybe he was waking up to remember the love. Frank didn't want to call his daughter, not at this hour. She had work in the morning, a family of her own, a life filled with meetings, school runs, and long to-do lists. And his friends? They were all asleep too, tucked away in their own quiet corners of the night. So when Frank woke up at 3, it wasn't just the absence of sleep he felt. It was the absence of connection, the kind of silence that wasn't just around him, but inside him. This wasn't insomnia. It wasn't restlessness. It was loneliness accumulated over time like dust on a bookshelf. Slow, quiet, and barely noticed until it became too much to ignore. Psychologists have found that loneliness, especially in the later years of life, doesn't always show up during the day. It waits until the world goes quiet, when there are no voices to answer, no laughter down the hall, no footsteps overhead. That's when it speaks the loudest. Studies from institutions like UCLA and Harvard have shown a direct link between nighttime awakenings and increased feelings of emotional isolation in older adults, particularly those who live alone or have lost a spouse. But it was in that very silence that something surprising began to shift for Frank. He started writing. Not grand essays or letters meant to be sent, but simple things, a memory that floated up, a thought he hadn't said aloud, a line that began with "I miss you" and ended with something he didn't know he still carried. Sometimes he wrote to his wife, sometimes to his younger self, and sometimes just to the dark. At first it felt strange, like talking to no one. But over time, it began to feel like talking to someone who had always been there, himself. That small act, picking up a pen when no one else was awake, became his way of making space for the feelings that had nowhere else to go. It turned 3 a.m. from a moment of despair into a moment of dialogue, and in that, something softened. Therapists often recommend journaling as a way to manage nighttime rumination, to externalize inner thoughts so they stop echoing in circles. What Frank discovered on his own was something professionals now affirm. When we give our thoughts a place to land, they lose some of their weight. He didn't always find answers in those pages, but he did find presence. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. Frank didn't change everything all at once. It started with a single thought. Maybe the problem wasn't just that he was waking up too early. Maybe it was that his nights had lost their rhythm, so he began to create one. He noticed that on the days he went to bed at different times, he felt more unsettled. On the nights he fell asleep in front of the TV, he woke more abruptly. There was no structure, no quiet ritual that told his body, it's time to rest. So he made one. He began turning off his screens by 8:30. The harsh light of the television was replaced by a warm bedside lamp. He would make himself a cup of chamomile tea, not just for the sleep benefits, but for the ceremony of it. He stopped treating sleep like something automatic and started treating it like something sacred. Sleep researchers have long emphasized the power of consistency. The body's internal clock, its circadian rhythm, functions best when it knows what to expect. Going to bed and waking up at the same time every day helps reinforce natural sleep-wake cycles, even as they shift with age. Dr. Rachel Kim, a behavioral sleep therapist, puts it simply, your brain loves predictability. When you give it cues, dimmed lights, quiet music, a cool room, it begins to associate those signals with sleep. And over time, falling asleep becomes easier, more natural. Frank also adjusted the environment around him. He lowered the thermostat slightly, replaced his heavy comforter with breathable cotton sheets, and added blackout curtains to keep the early morning light at bay. Small changes, but meaningful. He placed a lavender sachet by his pillow, not because he believed in magic, but because the scent reminded him of his wife's favorite garden. And in that memory, there was calm. He stopped eating too late. No more heavy dinners at 8 p.m., no more late-night coffee out of habit. He learned that what he did during the day had everything to do with how he slept at night. Bit by bit, his bedroom became less of a room and more of a signal, a place that whispered, not shouted, you are safe now. You can let go. And in that space, sleep returned. Not perfectly, not always, but more often and more gently. Frank didn't think of himself as someone who meditated. That always seemed like something other people did. People in yoga classes or reading self-help books on the beach. But something changed the morning he woke up, heart pounding, breath short and mind racing, with no memory of a dream, no trigger, just panic. He sat on the edge of the bed, feet flat on the floor, palms resting on his knees. Instinctively, he closed his eyes and just breathed. Slowly, one breath in, one breath out. He didn't count, he didn't chant. He just sat with himself. It wasn't complicated, but it worked. That moment became the beginning of a new practice, one that would quietly change his nights. Frank began exploring short breathing exercises, simple ones, like inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 7, exhaling for 8. He found them on YouTube in apps designed for people over 60, even printed on little handouts at the clinic. Experts call this kind of breathing parasympathetic activation, a way to shift the nervous system out of fight or flight and into rest and digest. It's backed by science, but more than that, is something that can be felt, immediately, gently, like a light being dimmed. He also continued writing. Only now it wasn't just about memories. It was about emotions he hadn't named, words he hadn't said. He wrote to people he missed, to versions of himself he was still learning to forgive. He didn't share these pages with anyone. They weren't meant for the world. They were meant for peace. Therapists call this expressive writing, the act of putting words to emotion as a form of self-processing. Research has shown that just 15 minutes a day, even a few times a week, can lower anxiety, improve sleep, and help regulate mood. For Frank, it wasn't about solving anything. It was about softening the weight of everything. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night with thoughts that won't leave you alone, try this. Keep a small notebook by your bed. When your mind starts spinning, write. It doesn't have to be poetic. It doesn't even have to make sense. Just let your thoughts have somewhere to go. And if writing feels too much, try sitting in silence. Place your hand over your heart. Breathe in slowly. Remind yourself, I am safe. I am still here. I can rest. These may sound like small things, but in the world of sleep and healing, small things are often the most powerful. Frank didn't become a monk or a therapist. He was still a retired history teacher who missed his wife and liked his coffee strong. But now he had tools, quiet ones, gentle ones, tools that didn't try to silence the thoughts, but instead gave them space to settle. And little by little, the 3 a.m. hour stopped feeling like a storm. It became a quiet shore where he could sit, breathe, and simply be. What about you? If you've ever found yourself staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, wondering what's wrong with you, I hope you'll remember, maybe nothing is wrong at all. Maybe your body, your heart, and your history are simply asking to be heard. And the most powerful thing you can do is listen. Frank had carried more pain than he realized, not the loud kind, not the kind that breaks you in public. His pain was quiet, tucked away behind old habits and polite smiles. The kind of grief that lives in the corners of a room long after someone is gone. There were things he never said, not because he didn't want to, but because the moment passed and then it felt too late. Regrets about small arguments, about the day he left the hospital room to take a phone call, only to return and find her sleeping too deeply to speak again, about the time he chose silence when she needed reassurance. He never called them regrets, not out loud. But at 3 a.m., they showed up. Not to punish him, but to be acknowledged, to be met with honesty, to be gently laid down, like stones pulled from heavy pockets. And over time, through writing, through breath, through moments of stillness and whispered forgiveness, Frank began to make peace, not with the past. That would never change, but with the weight of carrying it alone. He learned something that many of us don't realize until much later in life, that unresolved emotions don't disappear. They wait. They live quietly inside the body, surfacing not always in tears, but in tension, in fatigue, in those wakeful hours we can't explain. Therapists describe this as emotional backlog, and it's more common than most people think. The brain, particularly during early morning hours, has fewer distractions. The subconscious opens its hands and reveals what we've pushed aside. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. Frank stopped seeing his 3 a.m. awakenings as intrusions. He began to view them as invitations, not to worry, but to witness, not to fear, but to feel. He didn't always write when he woke. Sometimes he simply sat. Sometimes he whispered a prayer. Sometimes he imagined his wife was still sitting across from him in the chair she always loved and just talked, quietly, honestly, without shame. And in doing that, something inside him softened. He no longer felt the need to fight sleep, or fix himself, or search for a cure. He had found something better, understanding, acceptance, and above all, compassion. Not just for the life he lived, but for the person he was still becoming. He once feared 3 a.m. because he didn't understand it. Now he sees it differently, not as a curse, but as a calling. Frank no longer feared 3 a.m. In fact, he began to look forward to it. He called it his sacred hour, not because it was dramatic or miraculous, but because it was his, undisturbed, quiet, honest. There were no emails, no phone calls, no headlines screaming for attention, just the soft hush of the house, the rhythmic pulse of his breath, and the small sound of a pen meeting paper. Some mornings, he wrote to his wife, other times to himself. Once he simply wrote one sentence, "I'm still here." It wasn't a declaration, it was a grounding. Frank didn't meditate in the traditional sense, but he did sit. He breathed. He let the stillness hold him instead of resisting it. And slowly, the space that once held anxiety and regret began to hold something else. Presence. He watched the light shift in the sky, from blue-black to a soft silver. He felt the way the morning air changed texture, just slightly, through the open window. He noticed things he hadn't in years. The rustle of trees, the smell of dew, the first sounds of birds stirring somewhere far off. This became his practice. Not to fix himself, but to be with himself. And in that space, in that sacred hour, something began to change. Not overnight, not in grand sweeping gestures, but gently, like a garden learning how to bloom again after a long winter. Frank began to feel alive, not just awake, but truly alive, reconnected to something he thought was lost, his own voice, his own rhythm, his own inner light. And if you've ever woken at 3 a.m. with the weight of the world on your chest, if you've ever felt like no one understands what it means to be wide awake while the rest of the world sleeps, maybe that hour is yours too. Maybe, just maybe, the quiet you're hearing is the beginning of your own sacred hour. So maybe it's not just about sleep. Maybe waking up at 3 a.m. is your body whispering. Pause, slow down, feel. Maybe it's your soul, gently asking to be heard. Tonight we walked with Frank. We saw how aging shifts the rhythm of the body, how light sleep and early cortisol can stir us awake. We saw how unspoken feelings, old regrets, and quiet loneliness have a way of showing up when the world is silent. But we also saw something else, that within that silence, there can be peace. Through breathing, through writing, through accepting rather than resisting, Frank turned his wakefulness into a ritual. He stopped fighting the hour and started embracing it. And you can too. If you find yourself awake in the stillness of the night, know this. You're not broken. You're not alone. You're simply being invited back to yourself. So light a candle, take a breath, write a sentence. Let 3 a.m. become your sacred hour. And if this story spoke to something in you, something quiet, something true, we'd be honored if you'd share it. Leave a comment below. Let us know what your 3 a.m. feels like. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that soothe, stories that understand, click like, subscribe to Golden Wise Elders, and turn on the little bell. We'll be right here, waiting for you. Until next time, rest gently.